Hello everyone and welcome back to lesson number 4 on Microsoft Project. My name is Frank Perini, and if you're just joining us for the first time, please go ahead and check out the first series of tutorials that will lead up to this one. We're working through a Microsoft project file and we're continually building on what we've learned. So if you haven't had a chance to watch those videos, I'd encourage you to go back and work through those and follow along. I already have opened up the previous file that we had from the last lesson, and I've already renamed it as video4.mpp. So you can either save a new copy of your file, or you can just work off of the last one. It's either way is okay. And I'd just like to kind of refresh where we're at so far, and then today we're going to transition into a new topic on resources. So far we've only been looking at tasks and durations and start and finish dates, and we've looked at predecessors. We developed this Gantt chart and we talked about relationships between tasks having relationships with one another. We talked about setting up other types of constraints, like for example, start as soon as possible, as late as possible, finish no earlier than, etc. And we also talked about the musts and how you must stay away from them. The use case for those is a little bit rare, as it can basically force Microsoft Project to break all of the rules to make that happen, and it can cause unexpected results. So where we're at right now with the training, we're still kind of at the early stages, but I would say when I meet with people learning Microsoft Project or project and program managers, most people kind of get to this level on their own where they're able to create tasks. They kind of get that part, it's like a spreadsheet. They're able to create start and finish dates that they think make sense. They can kind of connect the dots, right, with the links, the relationships, the constraints. And then I think this is where most people start to kind of drop off of Microsoft Project learning. They kind of think this is Microsoft Project, getting our tasks, our dates, and our Gantt chart, But there's really so much more Project can do for you, and that's why I encourage you to kind of stay with me and continue. Eventually, we're going to get to where Microsoft Project is helping us manage resources, costs. We're looking at cash flow on a project. There's a lot of functionality, and I think one of the unfortunate things is a lot of people using Microsoft Project, they only use it for, basically creating a Gantt chart, and there's so much more functionality than that. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and start looking at resources. So to do that, we're going to change views. We had talked about views in another lesson. We're going to go ahead and change our view from this task view, which is called the Gantt chart view, which has a task sheet on the left and a Gantt chart on the right. We're going to change this to what's called the resource sheet. And you can do that either by clicking down here where my mouse is on this resource sheet icon, or you could go up to view and click on the drop down and you could choose resource sheet. Again, this is where you'll find all of the built-in views with Microsoft Project, and they're basically named by what the main focus is. So you can obviously see that these are focused on resources, which we're going to start talking about today. These are focused on tasks. And then there's some other ones like the timeline and calendar, etc. So today we're going to focus on the resource sheet. So go ahead and click on resource sheet. Either click on this drop down or you can click this icon down here. And this opens up what looks like another spreadsheet type view, but it's going to be blank because we haven't added any resources to our project yet. So what is a resource? Let's just start with that. What is a resource? Well, by default, you should have the same columns as I do, and if you don't, that's okay. If you've somehow changed your column view, you're going to want to follow along and look at the same columns as me. And the way to do that is you can click on Add New Column, and you'll see a list of all the columns that can be added. Again, Project is like a database, so all of this data, even if it's not showing on your screen, it's all in there. So we're going to want to look at the type first, the type column. And if you can't find that in your sheet, you're going to want to scroll down until you get to the T's, and you're going to see type, and click on that, and it will add a new type. Okay. Now, just to illustrate my point about this being a database, let me show you an example. So if I take the first and I set this to work, see how this is set to work? Because both of these columns are referencing the same piece of data. So this is not two different columns. Actually, this is the same piece of data in the database being looked at by two columns in two different places. It's the same data being referenced by two different columns. So I'm going to hide this. Notice how I can't delete it. It doesn't ask me if I want to delete that because it can't be deleted. It's data in the database. I can hide that though. So I'm going to hide it on mine since I already have it over here. But if you need to add that, you can click on this add a column, click on the type, and then if you want, you can also drag it over to the spot where it is on my screen if you want to follow along. Okay, I'm going to hide my extra one. So what is a resource on a project? Let's start with the absolute basic. Well, let's look at the three types of resources options that are available in Microsoft Project. The first is called work. The second is called material. And the third is called cost. So in Microsoft Project, a work type resource is any resource that is effectively charged at an hourly rate. So an example of a work resource, of course, would be people. You would pay somebody X dollars per hour for certain types of work on your program or project. That would be a work resource. But it doesn't only have to be people. A work resource is anything that you want to basically charge to your project with a time based on time. So another example that I've used, so let's actually create some examples of work resources. I think this will be helpful. So the first is, I'll put my name in. You could put anybody's name in. So the first is a person like me. So Frank Perini is a work resource. Okay. We'll talk more about some other columns a little bit and how those can be used. Okay, then there's a max column, which I'll talk about in a minute. But Frank is a certain person working on my project. He's a work resource, and he has a standard rate and an overtime rate. So maybe my standard rate is $25 per hour, and my overtime rate is $35 per hour. Okay. And then there's also a cost per use, and I'll get to that in a minute. So a cost, I'll get to an example in a minute, but what is a cost per use? Well, a cost per use is even if the resource charges you by the hour, there may be a setup fee that you have to pay every time you want to use that resource. So just using that resource for 1 hour, there's a setup fee that is accrued every time, whether you want to use it for 1 hour or for 100 hours. So the cost per use is a function that lets project add in that cost that's accrued every time you use that resource. Every time a resource is set up. So what's a good example of a cost per use? So maybe a good example is you have some sort of machine line, let's say. So, you might have let's just call it like widget machine line. Or instead of machine line, let's call this like widget, 3D printer. Just as an example. So it's some sort of thing that does something. It's a widget maker, or it's a widget doer. Maybe it's a widget, maybe not a 3D printer. Maybe it's a widget cutter. This might make more sense. So maybe you have to pay for this piece of machinery by the hour, and it just cuts widgets all day, or it just does some process all day, every day, and you have to pay, maybe that costs $30 per hour for that piece of equipment. Just whatever, it doesn't matter for this example. So it costs X number of dollars per hour for this piece of equipment to work every day, all day. But every time you use this piece of equipment, you have to pay a setup fee. So maybe every time you take your product to this shop and they say, okay, we'll charge you $30 an hour for this piece of equipment, there's a setup fee, and that setup fee is $150. So that means when we use this in our resource, when we use this resource in our project, if I were to use this for 1 hour, I would have to pay the $30 per hour. Project would add on $150 cost for the setup. So if I had three different sessions scheduled on different dates, and every session was 1 hour, each of those sessions would cost $180. Project would charge the $150 setup fee every time, which is the cost per use. And on top of that, project would charge to my project, it would calculate the $30 for the 1 hour of duration that I use that resource. So normally with people, we don't pay them for a setup fee. That's more for equipment or processes that are charged by the hour, but maybe there's some sort of setup fee every time you initiate that. Okay? Let me give you another example of a work resource that I use in my projects, which is CFD analysis. Right? CFD or FEA. So if you're not familiar, CFD is computational fluid dynamics. It's basically modeling liquids and heat transfer. So it's a very intensive, CPU intensive process. It takes hundreds of cores of computing, to do a project in a reasonable amount of time. So usually we pay for a company to do our CFD calculations. We basically pay like a server farm fee, if you will. And that server farm fee is based per hour. So there's no cost per use in that case, but we might pay, $300 per hour of computation time that we use for that, X number of cores on that server farm. So that's another example of a resource. It doesn't have to be just of a work resource. It's not just a person. It's any resource that your project needs to use that charges cost to your project based on the duration, the number of work hours. Okay, and then you can optionally have a standard rate or an overtime rate, right? So my CFD analysis is not going to get overtime. If I have lots and lots of hours, I'm not going to pay my CFD overtime. So I could either just set that at 300 so the project knows, okay, any overtime hours are billed the same rate, or I could set it at 0 if I don't allocate any overtime to it. But those are all examples of work. So their work resources are people, they're processes that you have to pay for based on the duration of work or time that you use that process. And they also can accrue one-time cost per use, which is like a setup fee. Or it could be like a one-time permit fee, right? Maybe you have to pay, maybe you want to do something that costs a certain amount of dollars per hour, but there's a permit fee that every time you do that, you have to pay for a permit fee or whatever. So that's what the cost per use is, okay? So those are all examples of work resources. Okay, so let's talk about the max column. What is the max column? So the max column is, if you highlight your mouse over that, it says the maximum percentage or capacity number of units for which a resource is available during a time period. So what does that actually mean? Well, as a person, a human being, I'm only going to be available 100% because I can't clone myself and I can't make copies of myself. You may want more Frank Perinis working on your project, but just because you want that doesn't mean that can happen. But let's look at an example of work resources, another example where maybe we could make that happen. So on your project, instead of naming people, you may elect to say we have the mechanical engineering group. Let's say you could call it group or just mechanical engineering. And that's the mechanical engineering group. And let's just say that there's a certain rate. So, maybe the burdened overhead rate for your company, whatever, is $100 per hour or whatever. So we have this mechanical engineering group. We have, we've put in our hourly rates. We have a cost per use, which is 0 because we don't have to pay them every time we add them to a project. But if I were to start using this on my project, which we will do in the future, we'll start applying this to our planning and see how all this comes together, how resources and tasks come together. But if I was to use this like this, what I'm telling project is mechanical engineering is just basically one person. It can only be assigned at 100%. Anything above 100%, which in my case is 40 hours per week, based on my calendar. Again, it all goes back to your project calendar. So if I go to my project calendar, let's just look at that real quick. Right? I have 8 a.m. to 12 p.m., 1 p.m. to 5. So I have 8 to 5 with an hour lunch, right? That's my standard calendar from Monday through Friday. That's the standard calendar. And what I'm telling Microsoft Project is that this resource is one person that can work from 8 to 5. It's 40 hours per week of work. So if you schedule a task for more than 8 hours in a day, this resource can't do it. This person can't do it. If he does, it becomes overtime. So that doesn't really make sense for mechanical engineering group. Let's say that our mechanical engineering group has 10 people on it. Well, we wouldn't want to set this to 100%, which indicates just 100, just one person. We'd want to set that to 1,000%. Right? 1,000% divided by 100 is 10. Okay, I'm going to show you a trick that I use. You're welcome to use this too. I don't like looking at resources in percent because I usually think of resources as number of people. So you can actually change this. You can change this by going to File, Options, and you get these options, which we haven't gone into yet, and we will. But let's see, where is it? Yeah, so if I go to Schedule, and here where it says Show Assignment Units as Percentage, you can actually change this to decimal, which is my preferred way of doing it. And there's some other options in here like hours per day and other things, but let's just change this for now and hit OK. And you can see that it changes that display. Now the data really hasn't changed in the database, it's just a preference, but I like thinking of resources in quantities of whole numbers of people. So 10 people, this could even be half people. Let's say you have 10 people and on the team, but the engineering manager says, I'm only going to give you 3.5 people. You're going to get 3 full-time employees working on your project, and so-and-so is only going to work half-time on your project. We could count them as 3.5 people. So when we do this, depending on what we put in here, what we're telling Microsoft Project is all the work that I schedule to this mechanical engineering resource can now exceed the 40 hours. We can go back to our calendar, which is the standard 8 to 5, and in every day, I can schedule more than just 8 hours. I can schedule 8 times this multiplier. So every time, for every resource I have in here, they can work 8 hours on my project. That way I can do, if I had 5 tasks that take 8 hours, Project would let me schedule them all in parallel now without giving me a warning if I use the same resource, which we'll look at later. We'll look at some examples of that in a minute. But if I didn't have that, if I had this set to 1, it would give me a warning. Let's actually look at that. That's a good segue maybe into starting to apply resources, and we'll keep coming back and forth. This will also help us get used to looking at resources and tasks kind of together. So let's go back to the Gantt chart. So we can either click on Gantt chart here, or you can click on Gantt chart up here, or you can click on the task sheet, which hides the chart. It gives you the same sheet without the chart. I prefer working in this view when I'm not using the visual data because it's a little cleaner. So now I'm in the task sheet view. It's almost the same as the Gantt chart view, but it hides that Gantt chart. So I'm just focusing on getting the data. So let's look at that now. So let's go back to my resource sheet real quick, and let's just remember. So we have 4 resources. We have Frank, who's a person, right? We have a widget cutter machine, let's call it. We have CFD analysis, server farm, and we have mechanical engineering, which is a group of 5 people. Okay, so those are the resources that we've already entered. And we're not going to look at all the other columns yet, but we've entered those 5 resources into our project plan. Let's go back to the task sheet now. So now let's look at maybe the engineering as the example, and let's add a couple more items. So we have 3D modeling, we have 2D drawings, we have, let me insert a task. Okay, let's have CFD analysis, and let's say that can happen after 6. Okay, manufacturing specifications. Okay, so let's look at how do we start applying resources to our project. Actually, I am going to bring back the Gantt chart because it will actually let us see some things. The first thing I want to say is when we start looking at resources, I really encourage you, the first thing you want to have in your task sheet view is not just duration, start and finish. You want to have what's called the work column. Okay, and don't be fooled, there's actual work, which we'll talk about what the actuals mean and the baselines. But for today, for right now, let's get the work column in here. So the work column, and I'm going to drag it over here next to duration. So the work column is calculated by default based on the duration and the resource. We're going to talk about different types of tasks, maybe in another session, more of an advanced session, where there's fixed units, fixed work, and fixed duration. So I won't get into that right now. And then there's also effort-driven tasks, which I'll get into later. Essentially, that an effort-driven task means a task that you add more people will reduce the time. Some tasks, like for example, maybe 3D modeling or 2D drawings. Maybe if you have more engineers doing it, it should take less time because you have more engineers working on that. Some tasks, like concrete drying, it doesn't matter how many people you hire. You can't make it happen any faster. So that's where some of those more advanced topics come in. But let's go back to our example. So we have this Gantt chart right now. We have this CFD analysis floating down here. Okay, and let's maybe say that this takes, let's say the analysis takes 1 week to do. So you'll notice that we've added the work column again. Remember, click on add columns. We want to add work. Okay. You'll notice that, you'll notice that all the work is 0. And the reason is we haven't given any resources to this yet. So yes, this task takes time, but project hasn't assumed that it's a work package. So we could add hours. So I could say the 3D modeling takes 40 hours, but project by default will not put hours in there until I assign a resource to that. So let's look at that. So let's say for 3D modeling, and you'll notice now when I click on this resource dropdown, project has already started to pull my resources that I've created in my resource plan, in my resource sheet, and I can start to see all of the resources that I created. I have the CFD analysis, I have Frank Perini, I have mechanical engineering, and I have the widget cutter. So these are all different work resources. So for this first one, I can assign this to one or multiple resources. So let's assign this to mechanical engineering. And you can see when I assigned this to mechanical engineering, a few things happened. First, mechanical engineering shows up on the Gantt chart now. And this can be change the way that this displays, but this is handy for knowing, okay, who's working on what task when you start to print out these charts for, visual presentations. But it's also given me a notice that the work has changed. So project has automatically added 160 hours of work to my project. How did it calculate that? Well, it took the duration that I had created. I had created a duration of 1 month, and I added this resource, and it says it calculated that if I had this resource work on this project for 1 month, that would be 160 hours of work. 40 hours a week times 4, right, is 160 hours. Let's add another column, okay? And let's add the cost column. So again, not the actual cost, which we'll talk about, or the baseline. We want to find just something called cost, okay? And you'll notice that because I entered, let's go back to the task sheet, or the resource sheet for just a minute. Because I gave mechanical engineering a rate, a standard and overtime rate, because it knows the cost per hour for that resource. Oops, let's use the Gantt chart. It's able to determine that 160 hours of work of this resource will cost this much money to my project. So now you can start to see how project is becoming more robust. It's not just a Gantt chart creator. It's actually going to start to help us manage cost and schedule and scope, all of the key parts of program management. Okay, so we have this resource now and we have this cost. So, but what if I don't, what if the 1 month duration is correct? It takes 1 month. But what if it's 1 month for 3 engineers, not just one? 160 hours would not be correct, right? It would be 3 times that, because I have 3 full-time people working on this task for 1 month. So how would I do that? Well, I can double click on this task, and I can go to the resource tab, and I can see my resource list. And this is where I could add multiple resources to a task. And I can also assign units of a resource to a task. So if you remember, our mechanical engineering group is 5 people. And for this example, let's say you and the functional manager have kind of arranged a deal that you're going to get 3 people from mechanical engineering to work on this full-time for a month. You would change this units from 1 to 3. And let's see what happens when I do that. Okay, Microsoft Project did not change the hours, the work hours. I still have 160 hours of work. What Microsoft Project did was it said, you have 3 people working on this task. The duration must be shorter than your 1 full month. Because you have 3 people working on this, we can actually pull in this schedule. And it gave me a notice. And this goes back to the previous lesson where we talked about keep an eye on what you've changed and what assumption Microsoft Project has made, and make sure it's the right assumption. So if that was correct, if this task is only going to take if this task is only 160 hours of work and I put 3 people on it, then it should take less than a month. But what if I really meant, yeah, that's going to take about a whole month for 3 people, and I wanted to do that? Well, I can click on this little warning here, and I can say, change the amount of work, but keep the duration the same. Project is telling me it made this assumption, but it wants me to confirm that it was the correct assumption. You change the hours, resources, work per day units. Do you want to, A, change the duration, but keep the same amount of work? or B, change the work and keep the same duration. So you have a choice. So let's change it to the other option. Oops, did I click the wrong one? Sorry, maybe I clicked the wrong one. I wanted to illustrate that point. There, change the amount of work but keep the duration the same. So by choosing the other option, I told no, project, the assumption you made was wrong. I did want this to be a 1 month work package for 3 people full time. So project then calculates, okay, if that's what you wanted, then this work package is 480 hours of work, not just 160 hours of work. And you can see our cost has also adjusted accordingly. We now have $48,000 in engineering cost, where before I think we had $16,000 or something, because our work hours has drastically increased. Okay? So remember, our mechanical engineering max is 5. Now, let's look at a couple of examples and just see how is the resource sheet and the task sheet linked. I just want to kind of illustrate that linkage. So let's see what happens if I was to change this to 6 people. So let's say that I have a group of mechanical engineering that's 5 people, but I really need 6 people full time, and I hit enter. Let's see what happens when I do that. Okay, project made the same assumption that it made last time. It made the assumption that the work hours is correct. It's 400. It used the previous hours, the 480 hours, but instead of that taking a month, that should only take 0.5 months with 6 people full time, because we went from 3 people to 6 people. So it calculated that the time duration should be about half. But the problem is my resource group doesn't actually have that many people. How does project let me know that? Well, it gives me this little warning here, this little red person. And if you put your mouse over it, it says this task is over allocated. And you can right click for options. So I've told project I want 6 people working full time on this project, on this task. And it's saying that's more than what can be allocated based on your resource plan, based on your resource sheet. And I have this warning. So we can right click on that, and there's different options to fix that. Of course, you could ignore it. Maybe you have a secret plan worked out, and you could force project to ignore that. But that's usually not the best way to handle this, because it could cause a lot of confusion. So you can either fix it in the task inspector, which basically opens up that dialog, or you can reduce the work. So it's saying if you want to keep this at 0.5 months, you can do it, but you're going to have to reduce the amount of work hours if you want this done in 0.5 months, because you don't have 6 people. Let's look and see what happens when I do that. So the work hours has decreased. Okay. Let's undo that, and let's look at, I could increase the duration, right? So now I have 480 hours, but it's going to take me 0.6 months instead of 0.5 months, and all my dates have changed accordingly. Now you might be asking yourself, well, what changed, right? What changed with the resource allocation? Well, if I double click on this, you'll see when I made those changes, automatically project rescheduled the mechanical engineering, the max number from 6 down to 5. And that's what that little bracket indicates right there. Mechanical engineering bracket 5 indicates this resource at 5 units, okay? And we can confirm that by double clicking that, opening it, and looking at 5 units, okay? And let's look at how it's linked. So now I have a plan that's not broken, right? I have 480 hours, 0.6 months, so it's not broken again, okay? But what happens if, we lose one of our engineers? They resign, or another project comes up and we have to pull this engineering resource from our project. How would we confirm how that affects our project? Well, one way is we could go into our resource sheet and we could change our max units on our resource. Let's change that from 5 to 4 and see what happens. So as soon as I do that, in the resource sheet, I get a warning. And let's bounce back to the Gantt chart. You'll see I have the warning here too. So this is where I wanted to show you that this database is really all linked together in two different views, but it's all one database. It's telling me that in my resource plan, one of my resources has a problem and it's over allocated. It says this resource is over allocated. So I can see that very easily in my resource view. Okay. And I can go back to my Gantt chart and I can also try to identify what tasks have a resource problem. This task has a resource problem because I'm scheduling it for 5 units of work from that resource. But that resource pool of people is only 4 people. And project knows that that can't happen. Now, if I change that back to 5, the problem goes away. So that kind of shows you the link between the task sheet and the resource sheet and how this is all linked together. Okay? Let's look at another example. So let's remove the relationship here between 2D drawings and 3D models. And let's just, for illustration purposes, let's have these two tasks have the same predecessor, which is number 6. So they both can be scheduled as early as possible. Let's delete all the resources and let's set this to maybe 1 month and let's set this to 2 weeks. Let's just reset that a little bit. So we have these two tasks that maybe both need to work in parallel, both should work in parallel. Well, let's see how I could assign my mechanical engineering resources to that. So I assign mechanical engineering to the first, I assign mechanical engineering to the second. Okay. And you can see I don't have any scheduling conflict. Right? I have one resource unit assigned to each of these tasks by default. Now, what if I wanted to split this 3 and 2? Well, maybe I put 3 here. And let's increase the work hours. So we keep our 1 month. So I've got 3 people full-time on that. And let's maybe put 2 people on this. Okay, and let's reset that. So I keep my hours and I keep my original duration. So I have 1 month and 2 weeks, right? So let's see what happens if I change my resource pool size from 5 down to 4 when I have multiple tasks sharing that resource that are counting on that resource. I get the warning as I expected, and when I go back to my Gantt chart view, you'll notice both of these tasks are highlighted as a problem. Now I have 4 people. This is the interesting thing about this. I have 4 full-time mechanical engineering resources. So actually I have enough resources to do both of these tasks, one or the other. I could do 2D drawings because I only need 2 people, and I could do 3D modeling because I only need 3 people. But together with the current schedule, I cannot because they are both in parallel. And in parallel would require 5 people. So we're going to get into resource leveling, but this is where the power of Microsoft Project starts to come out. Even though in theory I have enough people to do both of these tasks, I can't do them in the schedule that's provided here because they run in parallel. And Project is going to give me some options to fix that as well. I can, because it knows that I have enough resources to do these tasks, but the problem is that I'm driving 2 tasks in parallel that are consuming all of the resources. Project is going to tell me you can fix this by rescheduling this to an available date. So let's try that. So since we want to prioritize 3D modeling over 2D drawings, let's reschedule 2D drawings to an available date because we have a work resource limitation. And let's keep an eye on the Gantt chart when we do that. So as you can see right now, we have Mechanical Engineering 3, we have Mechanical Engineering 2. Both are in parallel at the same start date. So let's take this resource and let's right-click on Reschedule to Available Date, which is like a resource leveling tool. Now when I did that, you'll notice that it moved that task to this date. After this work is complete, it can start. So this task will start as soon as possible based on resource availability now. It also cleared my errors. And if I go back to my resource sheet, you'll notice I don't have an error anymore. And the reason I don't have an error is these tasks, the new dates, now reflect the capability of that mechanical engineering pool of people, being 4 people. Okay? Let's look at another example of, tell you what, let's insert a task just to illustrate the cost per use that we talked about today. And let's just call this, widget cutter. Doesn't matter. So, and let's not worry about the predecessors. I want to illustrate the cost per use to you. So let's say that this takes 1 day of duration, and let's assign this to the widget cutter. So we're going to use the widget cutter for 1 day. Well, you can see project by default sets that to an 8-hour time period, and it assigns $390. So let's look at how did it calculate the $390. Okay, so my widget cutter is $30 an hour, right? So times 8 hours, so that's $240, right? And then I have to add on my setup cost, my one-time cost per use, $150. Oh, that wasn't right. 30 times 8 plus 150 is $390. So that's how it calculates that $390. It's the dollars per hour times the number of hours plus the setup fee. Okay? And just to illustrate the point, if we go back and change this to, let's say, 3 days, okay, our cost is 870 hours. We don't have to pay that. In project, you're not going to pay the cost per use based on the number of days. The cost per use is based on the number of tasks that you assign. So in this case, our cost would be calculated as 24 hours of total time, right? 3 days at 8 times 8 hours per day, right? Times 30, that's the 720. Then we add our one-time 150 cost and we get the 870. So this time period will not affect that setup cost. That cost per use is a one-time cost for this task. And like I said, a good use case for that is things like one-time fees, setup fees. It's kind of like when you call the cable company and they want to come and set up your cable. Of course, you have to pay for cable every month, but sometimes you have to pay that $29 activation fee. Well, you only pay that once, and you have to pay that every time you set up your cable. But once you pay that the first time, doesn't matter how many years you have cable, you shouldn't have to pay for that setup fee again, unless you're getting ripped off. So that's the use case for the setup, a setup fee by cost per use. Okay. We're going to talk more about resources and groups, and in the next session we'll get into materials and costs. I think this was enough for this session today, so I hope you found this basic tutorial on resources useful. We're going to get into more details on resource management with project. So again, thanks for joining today. Please like and subscribe to this channel if you find it useful to you, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.